Some say that life is a gift. Yet, for many, this gift feels more like a sentence. To exist means to experience pain, face disappointments, and live with an anguish that often defies explanation. If one cannot choose to be born, shouldn't there at least be the right to not exist? This isn't simply the desire to die, but something more subtle, more cruel. The wish to have never been born, to have never taken part in this game called existence. A perspective that may seem extreme, yet many share in silence. And so the question arises, is life itself unbearable, or is it the suffering it brings that makes us question everything? Throughout history, philosophers, writers, and even works of popular culture have confronted this unsettling truth. The pain of being alive is a weight that many try to endure, but for some, the only imaginable escape is to vanish, to dissolve, without going through death. But what does it truly mean to desire nothingness? Is it a rejection of life, or the expression of an even deeper pain? And most importantly, is there a way out of this cruel paradox? There are moments when this thought quietly slips into the mind. It is not a self-destructive fantasy, but an idea suspended between reality and impossibility, a paradoxical wish to exist without feeling its weight, to disappear without an end. For many, death is terrifying, not just for the pain that might accompany it, but for the uncertainty of what comes next. The unknown unsettles more than suffering itself, and the idea of fading away without facing that transition seems like a comforting, yet undoubtedly paradoxical and unattainable alternative. This feeling is far more common than one might think, yet it is rarely discussed. The silence surrounding it makes it even more enigmatic, almost as if people refuse to acknowledge its reality. And yet, behind this thought lies an even deeper question. Why can existence itself become unbearable? One of the most famous dialogues in The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky features Ivan rejecting God, not because he denies his existence, but because he cannot accept a world filled with suffering. It is not God that I do not accept. It is this world of his, created by him, that I do not accept and cannot agree with. His rejection is absolute. In the face of innocent suffering, no promise of paradise can suffice. Centuries later, Albert Camus would echo this perspective, arguing that the fundamental question of philosophy is not whether God exists, but whether life is worth living. However, those who wish to not exist are not necessarily rejecting life as a whole. Their longing is for nothingness, not as an escape from suffering, but as a pure desire for absence. It is not about denying the meaning of life, but rather about wanting no part in it. Here, an interesting contradiction emerges. The desire to disappear coexists with the will to keep living. This paradox can be understood through the theory of cognitive dissonance, which suggests that when the mind holds two conflicting beliefs, it chooses the one that is easier to sustain. In this case, the awareness that death is final and terrifying leads to the search for an escape that does not involve an end, but rather a painless dissolution. This theme is also explored in The Sickness Unto Death by Søren Kierkegaard, where despair is described as the inability to die, the impossibility of finding peace in annihilation. The greatest torment is to be unable to die, writes the Danish philosopher. Despair is not merely suffering, it is the impossibility of putting an end to it. And it is precisely this that leads some to dream of disappearing without having to endure the violence of death. But what happens when this despair becomes a constant state? Schopenhauer, in The World as Will and Representation, argues that individual existence is a source of suffering because every human being is inherently separate from others, condemned to desire without ever finding true fulfillment. Every satisfaction is only apparent. The moment a desire is fulfilled, another arises. His perspective is radical. As long as desire exists, so does suffering. And this is the central point. The desire to not exist is, ultimately, a desire itself. This idea is also explored in the acclaimed anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion, which, beneath its sci-fi exterior, hides a deep existential reflection. The protagonist, Shinji Ikari, does not wish to die, but rather fears existence itself. His struggle is not against an external enemy, but against his own sense of self. The Human Instrumentality Project, presented in the story, aims to erase all individual barriers, merging every consciousness into a single entity. In other words, the annihilation of individuality as a solution to suffering. But is this truly what one desires? In the end, Shinji's response is an attempt to accept his own existence, despite the pain that comes with it. Philosopher Jacques Lacan theorized that desire always arises in response to a lack. We do not desire what we already have, but rather what we perceive as missing. This applies even to the desire to not exist. It is a reaction to a sense of incompleteness, of failure in being recognized. Shame plays a crucial role in this process. Shame emerges when one feels undesirable, like a burden to others. And here lies another paradox. The desire to not exist does not stem from hatred for life, but from the fear of not being enough for it. The internal conflict between the need for connection and the desire to escape is at the heart of this condition. One seeks understanding, yet fears judgment. One longs to be acknowledged, yet wishes to disappear into nothingness. The great existential dilemma, then, is not just whether life is worth living, but whether it is possible to live without suffering. Here, Kierkegaard returns, suggesting that despair, no matter how distressing, can be a starting point for a deeper understanding of oneself. It is through the struggle with one's own existence that true acceptance can be reached. Perhaps, in the end, what one truly seeks is not dissolution, but a truce, a moment of silence amid the deafening noise of thoughts, a pause from the anguish that accompanies every choice, every mistake, every unfulfilled expectation. But life is not silent. It is a chaotic entanglement of conflicting emotions, an endless cycle of unmet desires, painful failures, hopeful anticipation, and inevitable disappointments. There is no final refuge from the weight of existence, and maybe that is the real dilemma. Finding the courage to stay, embracing unpredictability, and recognizing that pain and beauty often travel together. And perhaps welcoming all of this is the greatest challenge of all. So, is it possible to find meaning in existence by accepting the suffering that comes with it? Maybe the answer is not in annihilation, but in the search for a space where one can exist without fear.